Wonderful. Thank you very much for the kind introduction. Thanks for inviting me to give a presentation here at the Dark Field X-ray Macroscopy workshop, and welcome back from the lunch break. Today, I will be talking about dislocation ceramics, which is often a border topic of other topics, such as dislocations in metals, which are much better investigated. And today, I'm also going to talk about opportunities that we have with building understanding with dark field X-ray microscopy, where we already had quite some drastic advances in the past. I will structure it in 3 parts. First, there will be an overview about dislocation ceramics, because many of you may be unfamiliar with this kind of topic. Then there will be an in-depth analysis of a data set we acquired at Beamline 6. And in the end, I will open up a few questions on plasticity in ceramics. But first of all, for those who are not familiar with dislocations yet, a dislocation can be thought of as the end of an inserted half plane, which you see here depicted in red. And it terminates at the blue dislocation line, which you can see over here. And it's typically denoted in sketches with its T-shaped symbol and characterized by the Burgers vector. When the dislocation moves to the right or to the left on the gray slip plane, then it will deform all the upper planes versus the lower planes by shear. And with 100,000 kilometers of dislocations in a cubic centimeter of metals, that makes their nice mechanical properties. And when it comes to ceramics, things become a lot more difficult, because now on the purple slip planes, you have more than one kind of atom. You have positive strontium, you have positive titanium, and you have negative oxygen. And that means the number of suitable slip planes is typically lower, and often the mobility is lower. But some of the ceramics are deformable even at cryogenic temperature or at room temperature. And that means the dislocation mechanics is much less understood, and that makes it a great place for us to put some more research into. And on the bright side of things, the dislocation core in a ceramic typically comes with a core charge, which then also leads to a compensating space charge zone. And it also comes with a strained field, which of course makes it nice to observe with dark field X-ray microscopy. And the combination of space charge and strained field allows to tune basically all sorts of functional properties. I'll try to give an overview over those. One of them will be the deformation of rocks, which are quite similar to ceramics. And this happens deep underneath our feet right at this moment, and it happens typically slowly. You can try to do the same thing in your lab, take an as-sintered ceramic and then press on it with mechanically while putting a temperature, and you will also be able to deform the ceramic with dislocations, actually. I will give you an example of this later. And in some cases, to the surprise of many, you can actually toughen the ceramic by having nucleation of dislocations at a crack tip. Here you can see an image of magnesium oxide, which is dislocation toughened to an amazing 9.2 megapascal square meter. And as domain walls also can have a strained field and a charge, that means they can interact with dislocations, and we can use to tune domains with dislocations. And here you can see that upon deformation, this zinc sulfide single crystal changes its color. And that means it has changed the parent band gap. So you can also tune you can also tune optical properties. And the cool thing about this is that this deformation has taken place at room temperature, and actually it works best in darkness instead of in light. And also we can tune the conductivity with dislocations, where when we put dislocations into a material, we can either strongly increase the conductivity or strongly decrease it. And also with the suitable dislocation density, we are able to tune the thermal conductivity of our ceramics. And that means dislocations are actually quite versatile tool, which can be applied for many functional applications. The problem with it is that they're rather hard to fabricate, and the most interesting thing is that understanding about them is still infantile compared to, for example, point effects or grain boundaries. So to give you an overview of what kind of materials are out there,
there are, in my head, there's three types of materials which are important to us. One of them is the alkali halides, which are very well investigated materials. In terms of dislocation mechanics, there's semiconductors, and there's oxides with an important subgroup of perovskites. And the interesting thing is that all the materials marked in yellow now are deformable at room temperature. So dislocations are mobile at room temperature in all of these ceramics, which is interesting, as for example, magnesium oxide has a melting point of almost 3000 degrees C, and you can still deform it at room temperature. So there's lots of room to research. If you want to do research on dislocations on ionic materials, then we have to consider that there's quite good literature from the 1960s and 70s with very broad reviews on alkali halides, where dislocation mechanics and their conductivity have been studied in a lot of detail. And also, we should look at the prime candidates, such as YZ or MgO, which are well documented. And here in this image, you can see an X-ray topography image from 1983. So that's about 40 years ago. We can see a single crystal which has been compressed in the horizontal direction, and you can see slip bands forming in this image, which is really nice to see. But with the advancement of technologies, in particular dark field X-ray microscopy, we can do much better today. And lastly, in our research group in Darmstadt, which I'm going to introduce in the end, we're working on quite a few different materials, which is very helpful because there's so many versatile mechanisms that it makes sense to look at many materials at the same time to get a proper overview. Okay, two teases from our work in Darmstadt I would like to give you, which illustrate how interesting the dislocation behavior in ceramics can be. If you measure the conductivity in terms of impedance of a pristine titanium dioxide crystal, it looks like this. If you go ahead and deform the crystal at 1150 degrees C, you can see that the dislocations form kind of bundles and leave recovered areas behind, visualized by edge bits here, and they actually form really nice arrays with very high density and with virtually zero density in the rest. And you can see this in the ultra high voltage TM image. The dislocations are only like 30 nanometers apart. And if you do this, then the conductivity becomes higher. So we increase the conductivity by deformation at 1050 degrees C, while if you deform at 900 degrees C, the dislocations will be very homogeneously spaced, and they will not really be next to each other, and that means you will increase the resistivity. And with that, you can kind of choose by the dislocation structure whether you have donor or acceptor-like self-doping in titanium dioxide. That means you can introduce donor-like or acceptor-like behavior actually almost to the same degree just by choosing the deformation parameters and tuning your dislocation microstructure. The second thing which I want to show you today so for explaining how this conductivity increase works, the thought needs to be split into three things. One is the arrangement of the dislocation, the mesoscopic structure, which can be like small loops, straight lines, wavy lines, and dislocations can be very messy and have all these kind of features. At the same time, the core structure can be quite different between different materials or different slip systems. And there will also be a space charge. And the effective behavior will be a convolution of these three. Like when you have an XRD pattern, you will have the features of the defects will convolute with the lattice and will convolute with the atom positions. And only deconvolution will help you understand what's going on. And the same thing applies for structuring dislocations in ceramics, which has a completely new design dimension as these are one-dimensional defects. And the second thing I want to talk to you about, I want to highlight, is a result from our beam time here at the ID06. When you look here, this is a pristine strontium titanate polycrystal, and if you look closely, you see that there are exactly 0 dislocations, and that's the typical case for ceramics. And our investigation
helped us to ask a lot of questions, and in the end asked the question, what happens if we put dislocations in there? And if instead of a pristine crystal where there's basically no dislocation, you take a crystal with a sufficient dislocation density in the range of 5 × 10⁻14, then instead of cracking of the ceramic, you get perfectly plastic deformation. So you can increase the fracture toughness of ceramics and improve the mechanical behavior by putting enough mobile dislocations into the ceramic, which is amazing because in my bachelor's degree, I learned that dislocations are not a thing in ceramics. Then actually you can toughen them and you can change their conductivity. So that's really interesting. So now I want to come to the part where which you Simons initiated by asking our research group to have a beam time together, which Carsten Detlefs and John Nilderem were very helpful with, and to investigate dislocations in a ceramic single crystal, we took a strontium titanate single crystal and pressed on it uniaxially, while before that we introduced a small notch with a diamond wire saw. And that means we have a stress concentration and we will get slip bands focused around the notch. And if we zoom into the slip bands, which are visualized by etching with hydrofluoric acid, so we have etch bits for the dislocations, we see that there are slip bands formed, and in between there are virtually dislocation-free areas. And that's why we're going to zoom in with dark field X-ray macroscopy with topotomo mode here. So we can see the crystal here, where the notch is on this side, and we can see the dislocation bands coming here in the middle. And you see that the top and the bottom, the bottom surface are quite rough. And that's because the crystal that we actually wanted to observe was delivered by our manufacturer 3 weeks after the beam time. So we worked with a tiny shrapnel where the surface polishing wasn't able to do. And that's bad because the pictures are a little bit obscured, but that's good because we have plenty of samples left for further investigations. If you now zoom closer, we see these wavy lines, which is the surface damage, and we see these horizontal lines, which are the slip bands. And now, when tilting the perspective, we can see this whole messy network, and at the tip of the slip bands, we can really see each individual dislocation. And that's pretty cool because it shows us that in between, there's virtually no dislocation. All the dislocations are bundled in these kind of slip lines. And they trace all the way from the top to the bottom, and that helps us understand how the percolating path for a conductive pathway should look like in the end. And if you look into more closely, then we can see the dislocations here in the middle. And if we move forward in the video and look at the tilting of the slip line in higher resolution, we can see that if you look at these dislocations very closely, that we can really see each of the dislocations individually. Like we can trace them all the way from the top to the bottom, and we can see where they meet and where they come out of the plane. And the best thing about it is that with tilting, we are able to see it from a kind of 3D perspective and have a thickness which is, of course, way better than with TM images. And if you look closely here for this segment, for example, we see that there's a part of the dislocation which is in a completely different plane. And that means there's a cross slip going on. And I think that's the first image in full size I've seen in kind of 3D of this kind of mechanism. If you look closely, this whole mess has lots of segments which go out of the plane. So the dark field X-ray microscopy can really help us to understand a few things. And when we contrast it to ultra high voltage electron microscopy images, which can also penetrate 2 micrometer, at least those few microscopes which exist around the world, and we can see the individual dislocation at the tip of the band. We can see the mass inside of the slip band that agrees well. And we also see that the high temperature slip system, so a different kind of dislocation, has a much more suitable spacing for the dark field X-ray microscopy. And to understand it better, we attempted to scan the whole thing in 3D. And we see the dislocations here in blue, and we scanned in an 8-degree angle, and that's how it looks like. We can see the slip bands here, and they move from the bottom to the top in this image because we're moving the slices as a function of time in the video. And it's really nice to see how much mass it is, and sometimes you can pinpoint individual dislocation, but mostly it's kind of lost in the mass. And also we see these white shimmers going from the top to the bottom, which is most likely the dynamic scattering, which Hugh Simons has been talking about. And since it's a 3-dimensional data set, we can, in retrospective, turn it around and look from the top. And that's what we're doing on the next slide here. And we're now looking slice by slice from the bottom to the top. We see the surface defects, and we can see the dislocations here. And if you look closely, then you will still see the white shimmers from the opposite side shining all the way through the sample. And the unfortunate thing is, if you look at it as an evolution of time, it changes very slightly all the time. That means there's basically no way you can, in retrospect, calculate it out of your data. So it's really important to polish your surfaces perfectly, because otherwise you will have to deal with this kind of artifacts, even so you're slicing in 3D. So the lessons learned here are that the surface damage shines all the way through. So polishing is super important. There's no way around it. And the slicing direction should be very close to the line vector. With that, I mean, if you have a dislocation line and you slice like this, you will have a lot of contrast. If you slice like this, you will, in this way, you will have a lot of contrast, but a lower resolution. And this way, you will have low contrast, but high resolution. And there needs to be some kind of compromise. And doing it in a shallow angle was, in 8.4 angle, that was at least way too shallow for proper resolution. And if we do slicing, we should do slicing in as small slices as possible. And of course, from the data set, we can calculate the mosaicity, which is basically the lattice tilt in 2 dimensions. We can see the map here of the slip bands, and we can see that there's basically no long-range interactions. The other long-range effects are much more important, but we see a lot of local mass here. And we can also scan that through layer by layer. We see again the bottom damage, and we can identify the slip bands here. But we also note that if you really want to look dislocation by dislocation, then we would need to improve the slicing conditions. If we want to assemble it as a 3D data set in the end, we could take, for example, the threshold of intensity in a certain diffraction condition and plot everything that's above a certain threshold. And we can see that we actually can see the slip bands, like here seen from the side, and that in some way we can kind of track the dislocation lines in a certain direction, but only so well at the moment. So the improvement that we would need here is having a better criterion for identifying where dislocations are, and maybe think about what we do when we have more than one dislocation per voxel. And from this study from Jacobson and Alias, we see the intensity plotted over the distance of a dislocation. And if we have this raw data and we know how it's supposed to look like, then we could think if we could apply a function like with the molecular dynamics simulations, where all the atoms which don't have perfect neighbors get put into a certain analysis mode, which extracts the Burgers vector and the dislocation line out of this kind of data set. And if you look here through the, if you look at the dislocation band and plot the data along this dislocation band, we can see that with the first dislocation, okay, we have a peak in the data here and here and here, and there may be some way to have an automated extraction out of this in the future. At least that's what I hope for. Okay, and with this, I want to come to the last topic for today, which is high temperature plasticity of ceramics, which is a topic where I think a lot of progress can still be made in the future. So What you see on this image on the left is a pristine piece of strontium titanate polycrystal with basically no dislocations. And after 4% strain at 1150 degrees C, which is way below the sintering temperature, we can see plenty of dislocations in here. And this kind of topic has also been investigated in the 1970s, but since that's 50 years ago, we can have a totally new perspective today. So it kind of looks like we can hot forge ceramics, but it's more like in geology where things are a little bit slower. And to illustrate this more clearly, brought you a data set where we compress a strontium titanate single crystal uniaxially. The same thing works with polycrystals, but single crystals is easier for others to believe. And we can see that we have an elastic loading followed by plastic flow. And then for metals, we would typically expect an elastic unloading, but that's exactly what's not happening. Instead, you still have plastic flow during unloading of your sample until you reach about the same stress as before. That means this red thing here is not strain hardening. But if you would look at a curve for metals, we would always say that's strain hardening, but it's not. It's just stress-dependent plastic flow. And to illustrate this a bit, I brought you 2 videos. In the left one, you can see how dislocations should work in metals. They stand still most of the time, but if the traffic light turns green, the cars race forwards quite fast. So it's like in a traffic jam. And instead, in ceramics, it's more like kids on tricycles. They move slowly, but they do move at a rather constant speed. And that changes about everything here. So it becomes interesting because the velocity of dislocation is not the only thing. There's a lot of dislocation mechanisms involved, and that makes our life interesting as a researcher here. For example, if you have a titanium dioxide single crystal and you deform it once, then the yield stress drops, so it becomes easier to deform. If you deform it more often, it becomes more difficult to deform. So you have strain softening and strain hardening. If you look at the mobility limitation of this thing, you can see that the dislocations only have a certain velocity. And if you do strain hardening on those crystals, you can observe dislocation creep and a temperature-dependent yield strength. So that's 5 mechanisms already. And then interesting things can happen, such as when you do the same experiment in vacuum instead of ambient air, you change the yield strength by a factor of 10 just by going to the vacuum. And that's because you can basically do alloying with oxygen or de-alloying if you remove the oxygen partial pressure. So the idea we had in Darmstadt, and which worked quite fantastically in the end, is taking a sintered piece of ceramic, apply mechanical stress, and apply a temperature at the same time. And then what typically would happen is diffusion creep, grain boundary sliding, or fracture. But if you do synthesis correctly, then you can avoid these, at least for certain materials, and we can get lots of dislocation in the material and deform it by dislocation motion. For synthesis, please turn to Wolfgang Reinhammer. And this works quite fantastically. We can deform our ceramic by 25%, and that was only limited by the instrument range. And we can do this within less than an hour. And we see that the dislocation density continuously increases. In the first, increases quite drastically, and then only a little bit in the end. And we can quantify the macroscopic behavior with a plot where we keep the stress constant for a data point and plot the stress on the x-axis and record the strain rate on the y-axis. And we can see that with increasing temperature, we increase the strain rate quite drastically. And for strontium titanate, 1100 degrees C is kind of the turning point. And we see that at low stresses, there's a different behavior than at high stresses. And at high stresses, we can characterize the behavior by inactivation enthalpy and activation volume. And the interesting thing to note here is if you use 100 megapascal or 300 megapascal, then it only deforms like a little bit faster. That means the thing that's different to metals, if you press harder to deform it faster, it will just break. It will not deform faster, even though it's dislocations. And we can put this all into a kind of macroscopic description for the mechanism. So conclusions from here are that deformation of ceramics, and in particular perovskites or strontium titanate here, is possible, and we can do this to a very large extent. There's a multitude of mechanisms involved, which makes it fun to understand as a scientist. And we can really quantify the macroscopic behavior if you look from the right perspective. And dark field X-ray microscopy may be a link to really understand what's going on in the material and what are the underlying mechanisms. And with that, I want, for this, you could, for example, look at the dislocations in situ, so how they move at, for example, 900 or 1000 degrees C, look at the evolution when there's loop formation and so on. You could try to understand what the stress fields are which cause a dislocation source. It would be interesting to figure out how things behave in a polycrystal or how the dislocation arrangement is really going on here. And this brings me to the conclusion of all the opportunities I see for dark field X-ray microscopy for dislocation ceramics, which is that there's typically a lower density of dislocations than in metals, which means the spatial resolution of dark field X-ray microscopy is often enough to visualize each individual dislocation, which does not work for metals, or often does not work for metals. But also, in sometimes ceramics have a high enough density, so the resolution isn't sufficient. But there's good chances to have enough resolution with DFXM. Then we can try to understand the percolating path, like really get a 3D network of this. And as the structure of the network was shown so extremely crucial, that could be a path forward for understanding here. And we can try to understand the mechanisms which are going on in polycrystals or even in single crystals, where things such as dislocation motion or multiplication or intersection of dislocations would be an interesting thing to investigate. Ideally, that would be in situ deformation, time resolved, and that at a high temperature. I know that's kind of challenging with the current instrumentation, but there's enough experiments which come close enough to that, which you could do already. And of course, we could look at domain wall dislocation interaction. That will be an interesting thing because both are nicely visualizable. And we could try to think about whether we can index dislocations automatically from the data sets. And maybe the approach that Jan Schulte has introduced may also be suitable here, but that would need more cleaner data sets and more time spent on this kind of topic. And with this, I'd like to come to the end by thanking and introducing the whole dislocation team at TU Darmstadt of the research group of Professor Jürgen Grödel, where Marian Höfling and I have started as the first two PhD students to work on dislocations in ceramics. And now, since the field is rapidly expanding, we have plenty more researchers here, which you can see depicted in the second row. And if you want to talk about high temperature deformation, then this PhD student will be the one that can really help you with the experimentation. And with that, I want to thank you all for the attention and looking forward to your questions. And thanks again to you, Simons, for enabling both the beam time and inviting to this session. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Lukas. Just to be clear, I mean, it was this is all the ESRF's doing, right? I mean, you should thank them for the beam time, I think. But do we have any questions from the audience? Trying to view. If not, I have a question. I think, I've been thinking all morning about exactly this problem of indexing structural features which are smaller than the voxel, particularly from Sam's talk and from Jan's talk. And I'm really delighted to see you mention this as well. I'm wondering how you might think about going about doing that.
So that's a really good question. And the first thing I would try is to look at a clean data set of how the strain really looks like and how it looks in different tilting, like in different diffraction conditions, and whether there's a pattern which we could really extract. And then try to look within a data set for this kind of pattern and whether that matches to a screw dislocation or edge dislocation or a dislocation pair. But this would require a clean data set first, where we could get a reference of how it should should look like if it was ideal and isolated. And unfortunately, the data set that we took doesn't give that quality. So we would need a fresh data set with nice dislocations, and then maybe try to identify a pattern, which we could then try to find automatically in the rest of the data.
Yeah. So I gather Henning has a question. Henning?
Yes. So one complication when we look at metals, dislocations in metals, is that we have different length scales. So one thing is to look at the individual dislocations, but then they self-organize, and often they self-organize on more than one length scale. I mean, they organize into walls, and the walls then organize into small cells and so on. And of course, figuring out what length scale is relevant is important. Also, if you want to see if there's a difference between a single crystal and a polycrystal experiment. So with that background, I mean, to what extent does, I mean, can you rely on that for the ceramics, that you only have patterning, so to speak, on one length scale?
So I'll try to get an image of that, which was here, where you have a dislocation bundle here. I turn on the pointer once more. You have a bundle of dislocations here and a recovered area here. And if you zoom into this area, you see that these individual arrays, and again, zero density next to them. And then if you look into these, then you can see them lying very closely to each other, like at a distance of 30 nanometers. Well, the distance between two dislocation bundles is about 30 microns. So at least in titanium dioxide single crystals, we found different length scales where dislocations organize. For strontium titanate polycrystals, the grain size was limited to 2 to 10 micrometers. And in there, I have not seen a multi-scale behavior. So it should be all kind of characterizable on everything less than 10 micrometer.
Do we have any further questions? Just make one brief comment, Lukas, which is I really hope you get a chance to see Leora's talk. I believe, is it today or tomorrow? See, tomorrow it seems. As I think that'll show this kind of demonstration that these dynamic studies of dislocations are really possible. And I think, although in metals it's at a lower temperature than we're talking about ceramics, I think the point you make about us being close to being able to do this is entirely correct. And I think, as you point out, I think there's really a lot of great opportunities here, which I think you're very close to being able to take full advantage of. Okay. So with that said, and I can't see any more raised hands or questions.
Leora has actually raised her hand if you look on.
Has she? It's really, I have to say, it's very hard for me to see because I can't see all the speakers all at once. No, I can't. So Leora, sorry, if you have a question, please ask.
Hello. Does this work now?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Wonderful. Yeah, no, this is great work. Really interesting talk. And I hope that we get a chance to chat because I have been working on similar problems in 3D dislocation structures in metals. Really interesting. Not a question, sorry.
All right. Thanks, Leora. I think statements are also okay, as well as questions. So if anybody doesn't have any questions but would like to make a statement, then that's, I think, perfectly acceptable. But as I don't see any raised hands or questions in the chat, then I would suggest that we move on to our next talk, if that's okay. Thanks, Luke.